Hello and welcome to College Football on Air. I'm your host Carl Mogline along with Noah Taborda. Welcome in. Today is October 14th and we are entering week 8 of college football. All right, just to preview the day ahead for this show, day, night, year, who knows. Today we will be covering last week's games. We will be covering the Heisman race, our top 10s. We'll go over the AP and coaches poll as well. Maybe talk a little bit about the College Football Playoff Committee. Maybe not. Who knows? And then we will move on to next week's games and picks for every single top 25 game and a little more in-depth analysis of the games we actually care about. Because let's be honest, there's some that aren't good. And we will begin, though, with last week's games. And just to go over how we go through this, we start with the 25 ranked team, and then we will go down, basically. Also, sometimes we'll go up to Thursday games or whatnot if they're out of order, which is funny because the Friday game had the number 25 team in it, Stanford. They beat Washington State 34-17. They had a little bit of offensive punch, and they held Washington State to 17, which is pretty impressive because the week before, Connor Holiday, that Washington State quarterback, had set the record for career passing yards. Impressive in that. All right, we move on to the, it was the 22-ranked team, but it was a pretty good game, and they were undefeated and they are down. Now I bring in my co-host, Noah Taborda, which I realize I forgot to introduce. Noah.
Hey, Carl. Thank you for introducing me.
You're welcome.
I appreciate it. I'm glad that I'm on the show.
Yeah, you really should be. I was considering just leaving you there for the whole show and seeing if you ever chimed in.
Yeah, well, Noah's on the show, but he's not really on the show. He's just kind of here.
You know what? Whatever. All right. Duke, Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech was ranked 22nd. Not anymore. All right, they lost this game 25-31. Close game in the third quarter. Georgia Tech tried to mount the comeback, but Duke was too far out. It was 7-13 in the fourth quarter towards the Georgia Tech side, but they could not pull up the win. Georgia Tech is now 5-1, as is Duke. No real opinions there. We move on to East Carolina versus South Florida. South Florida lost 17-28. Both in the American Athletic Conference. East Carolina is now 5-1 with their only loss coming to South Carolina. All right, 16 Oklahoma State versus Kansas. Now, Kansas has lost basically every Big 12 game they've ever played. I'm just kidding, but in the last few years, yeah. Oklahoma State is 16th in the nation, come on. But they only won 27-20. Now, Oklahoma State does have some harder games coming up. I mean, coming up this week, they've got a big game against TCU. 2 weeks after that, they've got Kansas State on November 1st. Then they end with Baylor and Oklahoma. And don't forget, they've got West Virginia and Texas. It's not an easy stretch home for Oklahoma State. So, Noah, I'm going to ask you quickly. Do you think Oklahoma do you think they're going to pick up one more loss? Or, is this just going to be loss after loss after loss with a tough schedule in the end?
I mean, it's tough to say. The game against Kansas doesn't give you confidence. Kansas, one of the worst teams in college football, especially out of the top power conferences. At TCU, it's going to be a tough matchup. And at Kansas State, the problem is they play all of their tough games away from home. It wouldn't surprise me if this team ended up with four more losses by the end of the year. I'm looking at 3. I think they can get the win at Kansas State. But either way, it's going to be rough sailing for the rest of the year.
It's tough to see this for an Oklahoma State team. They almost beat Florida State in their first game. They've had a somewhat good season. That's their only loss. But, they just ran into a pretty hard Big 12 schedule. We're looking at a good Big 12 this year, which is interesting. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that when we move into TCU and Oklahoma later on. All right, that brings us to Georgia, Missouri. And Georgia just smoked Missouri. 34-0. They were without their star running back, Todd Gurley, but you know what? Chubb don't care. Nick Chubb, the running back for Georgia, went off in this game. 38 carries, 143 yards. He picked up the touchdown as well. Missouri had 379 total yards on offense, only gave up 147. Missouri's 4-2, but one of those losses is to Indiana. Come on. Now, their best win so far is over a team in South Carolina that nobody really thinks is good anymore. So, was this Missouri team overranked, in your opinion, heading into this season?
I've got to say so. this team, honestly, isn't anything special. Their numbers don't pop out at you. 98th passing yards, 78th rushing yards, 76.4, 49th points against. There's nothing special about this team. And when you have Matty Mock at quarterback, it doesn't give you much confidence. Everybody overrated this team. They looked at last year, they looked at James Franklin, and they thought, this is still a great team. Unfortunately, not so much.
Yeah, I think James Franklin was really undervalued last year at Missouri. I mean, I think there was some emphasis, the defense was just fantastic. And yes, it was. I mean, you have the SEC Co-Defensive Player of the Year on your team. Michael Sam was a beast last year on that rank. You got Coney Ely also coming up. I mean, that defense was great last year, but James Franklin had a really big role, and this offense put up 0 points against Georgia, who, in the past, earlier this season, Georgia has given up some points. I think James Franklin is severely undervalued, but also, you got to remember, Dorial Green-Beckham is gone, and that's a huge hit to this offense as well. I mean, he's a former number 1 overall prospect. So, I mean, they had a great second season in the SEC. Made it to an SEC title game, but I got to say, Missouri is not looking good. All right, that does bring us to our next game. The Red River Riot. Ooh, actually, I lied. Because my ESPN account has Oregon as a favorite team, disclaimer, Oregon's my favorite team, basically, they get moved to the top. Sorry. They're actually the next team. 12 versus 18, Oregon versus UCLA. Oregon taking the victory by 12, 42-30, but let's be honest here, it was not a 12-point game. There are some games that are much closer than their scorelines would predict. Not this one. UCLA scored the final 20 points. They were down 42-10 at one point. And, I mean, it was just kind of a bad game for them. I mean, 42-10 at the beginning of the fourth. When they entered the fourth quarter, Royce Freeman made it in a run. It was just really hard to watch this UCLA defense. I mean, the thing is, neither defense was good, to be honest with you. UCLA had 553 yards. But the key thing is, and this is something that me and Jake Liker, another anchor on this network, thought up. It's called Lama Focac, Liker and Mogline something and something. And it was for the NFL, but it was about certain stats. And it was about opportunity creation and capitalization. And I mean, when you look at this team in the red zone, they were not efficient. And they had 2 turnovers and Oregon had none. When you do that, they were okay on third down. They were doing okay. But, you know what? They got the third down too many times. I mean, 19 times they made it to fourth down. 11 times they converted, sure. But 19 different times they're on fourth down. 2 turnovers. 7 penalties for 81 yards. I mean, these are the type of things that just kill a football team. And you know what? Maybe it's closer than 12, or it was a real 12, if these mistakes aren't made. On the Oregon side, though, great, comeback game, if you will, for this offense, and specifically Jake Fisher, their right tackle, finally comes back from injury. I saw a post that was Jake Fisher for Heisman, and I gotta say, I could agree. I mean, he's the most important player on this team. Right now, it seems like, after the stunning loss to Arizona last week, this win puts Oregon back in the top 12, and it puts UCLA in an awkward situation. Now, some would, basically, let's just say their bandwagon got hot coming into the year. They were ranked, they got pushed basically almost to an even favorite with Oregon at one point by a lot of pundits. I mean, just because it was a bandwagon pick. So, now with 2 losses in a row, the first to Utah, now to Oregon, they play Cal, Colorado, then they get Arizona, then they end with USC and Stanford. They don't have any eye-popping numbers. Their defense is not great. But, Noah, you saw them in person against Memphis earlier this year. Now, what can you tell me about this UCLA team? Do you think they can rebound from this? Do you think they're only going to be a 2-loss team? Do you think they can win the Pac-12 South? Or is this team destined for another Sun Bowl?
Look, you know what? I still think they're actually going to make it out of the Pac-12 South, to be honest. I think they're going to run the table from here on out. Stanford could be tricky. The nice thing is this team, like Oregon, has a lot of offense in it. What I've just seen is that they just don't capitalize. There are some big issues on this team. And I think one of the biggest issues is that though they run the ball averagely, Paul Perkins, not bad, it's not with the effectiveness they need when you're trying to create a passing game and give Brett Hundley the opportunity he needs. And I think you could see this coming. They haven't had a game, except for the game against Texas, where they allowed less than 20, and it was against some pretty poor offensive teams. they have to tighten up on defense. You're going up against Anu Solomon. You're going up against Aguilar and Cody Kessler, Kevin Hogan, who's played great. And against that Stanford defense, they need to tighten up and they need to execute. Execution will win them the Pac-12 South. Lack thereof, and they are done.
Yeah, and UCLA now has 2 conference losses. But, I mean, those can almost all... Assuming that Utah loses another conference game, and let's just make that assumption, and assuming that Arizona State loses another conference game, if they beat Arizona and USC, along with a couple tiebreakers, it's not that hard to see them getting back in the Pac-12 South. Picture, everybody has at least 1 loss. UCLA has 2, and Colorado is currently 0-3, 2-4 overall, and just a little bit sad. Yeah. Poor Colorado. But that's UCLA. Now Oregon. And I repeat my pre-disclosure. So it's a post-pre-disclosure, I guess. Oregon is my team. I root for them. I cry for them. Don't ask about what happened after the Arizona game. But I think this does prove that the Arizona game probably would have turned out differently if you do have a healthy offensive line. I think this team, if this team is how it entered the season, they had lost 3 offensive tackles right now. If it's that team that doesn't lose those teams, I mean, they're easily undefeated. Even with Jake Fisher, they probably would be undefeated. So this actually goes to you, Noah. If you were a college football playoff committee member, do you look at that and say, over, say, another one-loss team, and they're very uncomparable, say. It's very hard to compare the two. They don't have any common opponents, yada, yada. It's not Michigan State, for goodness sake. Do you say they lost the game and you can see the offensive line issues, or do you, let's say, Oregon loses the unranked Arizona, who we should say went up to 10 after this, and then a team that lost to, say, Auburn or Mississippi State in the SEC, who's very high up, and that's their loss. Where do you rank a team? How do you compare these?
It's tough. I think the nice thing about the Arizona game is that they didn't get blown out. They kept it close. One thing to look at that I think they've got to win out for me to be in the playoff. I think a 2-loss conference champion isn't going to make it in.
No, except in the SEC. Except maybe in the SEC.
Except maybe the SEC. And to do that, just really quickly, in the past 2 games, fourth quarter and second half of Arizona, they've allowed 41 points in those 2 second halves. So they need to tighten up second half defense.
Well,
so some of the UCLA points were garbage time. Still, tighten up is important, especially when you have some good teams. Look, this team for me still could be a playoff team. I still think it will be. Game against Stanford is going to be hard. But if they get out of that game, I think they're a playoff team. I think this team can go 1 loss and make it through. And at the end of the day, they see a 1-loss team out of the Pac-12, which is widely regarded as the second best conference. They're going to be in the playoffs. I think they really will be.
I think I agree, and with my full bias, I support your opinion. All right, we now move on to a game I promised a while ago now, Oklahoma, Texas, the Red River rivalry. That's a tongue twister. All right, Oklahoma, Boomer Sooner versus Texas, Hook'em Horns. Full disclosure, Noah's a Texas-ish fan. It's his second
They're
team.
my second favorite team.
Exactly, that's why I said ish fan, because you're not a full fan.
But I'm a full fan. They're just my second favorite team.
Yeah, once we start talking about Ohio State next week, it'll be a whole different story.
Yes.
All right. Now, Texas, Oklahoma, Red River. It's a rivalry. It was Texas dominated this game in the stat column. 24 first downs to 11. 7 and 18 on third downs to 1 for 11. 482 total yards to 232. They were better in passing yards. They were better in rushing yards. They had, basically, the reason they lost was penalties and turnovers. 11 penalties, 85 yards, and a turnover. Texas played a pretty good game offensively, and not a bad one defensively. But it was those little mistakes that kept them from losing. But the fact is that Texas is 2-4 and no longer the power they used to be. Charlie Strong needs time to recuperate from basically saying, hey, I'm going to not make this program a terrible place anymore, and kicking off a bunch of players who had some serious issues. They now have 4 losses. 1 to BYU, 1 to UCLA, 1 to Baylor, 1 to Oklahoma. We should note those are all pretty good teams to lose to, but the fact is they're a 4-loss team. and Oklahoma.